The evening air had a bite to it as Robert Wilson pulled his modest sedan into the last available parking spot at Charlie's Place. The small restaurant sat between a bookshop and a hardware store that had been in the same family for generations. Nothing about Robert's appearance hinted at his $450 million net worth. His dark blue sweater had a small hole near the right cuff. His jeans were comfortable but far from designer. The watch on his wrist, though worth more than most people's cars, looked like something you might pick up at a department store unless you knew what to look for. Robert liked it that way. Tonight he wanted to be nobody. The smells hit him first as he pulled open the heavy wooden door. Garlic, fresh bread, and something sweet he couldn't quite place. The restaurant wasn't fancy, just honest food served by honest people. Exactly what he needed after 3 weeks of board meetings, investment pitches, and charity galas where everyone wanted something from him. "Table for one?" asked a young man near the entrance, grabbing a menu without waiting for Robert's answer. The place was busier than Robert had expected for a Tuesday night. Nearly every table was filled with people talking, laughing, and enjoying their meals. "Yes, please," Robert replied, following the young man through the maze of tables to a small two-person setup near the back wall. It wasn't until he was seated that Robert noticed it. The piano. It sat in the corner, an old baby grand with a rich mahogany finish that had darkened with age. Even from across the room, Robert could see the small scratches and watermarks that told the story of years of use. A thin layer of dust on its closed lid suggested it hadn't been played in some time. Robert's heart beat a little faster. He recognized that piano. Not just the make or model, this exact piano. The small dent on the left side. The distinctive pattern of the wood grain. The slightly worn ivory on the E-flat key that had always stuck just a little when he was a boy. "Can I get you something to drink while you look at the menu?" The voice pulled Robert from his thoughts. He looked up to see a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and a genuine smile. Her name tag read, Lisa. "Just water, thank you," Robert said, accepting the menu but barely glancing at it. His eyes drifted back to the piano. "That's a beautiful instrument." Lisa followed his gaze and nodded. "Been here longer than I have. The owner's grandfather bought it years ago. Doesn't work properly anymore, though. Just looks nice." Robert nodded, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. Doesn't work properly. If only she knew. If only any of them knew. When Lisa returned with his water, Robert ordered without really thinking, some pasta dish that was the first thing his eyes landed on when he finally looked at the menu. As Lisa walked away, he found himself stealing glances at the piano again and again. His fingers tapped lightly against the table, playing phantom notes of a piece he hadn't performed in 15 years. The restaurant filled up even more as the evening went on. A birthday celebration broke into song at one table. A couple near the window leaned close, speaking in hushed, intimate tones. A group of friends roared with laughter at some shared joke. And through it all, the piano sat silent, forgotten by everyone except Robert. His meal arrived, and he ate mechanically, hardly tasting the food. In his mind, he was 16 again, sitting at that very piano on the stage of the Henderson Community Music Hall, playing Chopin while his mother watched from the front row, her eyes shining with pride. Back then, everyone said he was going to be one of the greats. Back then, the future stretched out before him like an endless symphony. Then came the accident that took his mother. Then came the pressure. The panic attacks before performances. The collapse backstage at Carnegie Hall at 19 that made headlines in all the wrong ways. After that, Robert had put away his sheet music and turned his attention to business, discovering a different kind of talent that eventually made him wealthy beyond imagination. But he had never played in public again. Not once in 15 years. Lisa returned to his table. "How is everything?" "It's good," Robert said automatically, though he couldn't have described what he was eating if someone had put a gun to his head. "Can I ask you something about the piano?" Lisa glanced over at it. "What about it?" "You said it doesn't work properly. What's wrong with it?" Lisa shrugged. "I don't know much about pianos. The owner says some of the keys don't play right, and getting it fixed would cost more than it's worth. Nobody really plays it anyway. It's just there." Robert nodded slowly, his mind already made up, though he hadn't admitted it to himself yet. "Do you know how the restaurant came to have it? It's quite unusual for a place like this. The story goes that the owner's grandfather bought it when the old music hall closed down. He played a little and always wanted a grand piano. But honestly, it's just taking up space now. The owners talked about selling it, but nobody wants a broken piano. Robert felt something cold settle in his stomach. Selling it. Getting rid of it. The piano that had been the beginning of everything for him. "Are you a piano player?" Lisa asked, noticing his interest. Robert hesitated. "I used to be," he said finally. "A long time ago." "Well, don't get any ideas," Lisa said with a small laugh. "The owner doesn't let anyone touch it. Says it's a liability or something. Last guy who tried got thrown out." As Lisa walked away to check on another table, Robert finished his meal in silence. Around him, the restaurant continued its lively hum of conversation. A harried-looking man in a chef's coat emerged briefly from the kitchen, surveying the dining room before disappearing again. The door opened and closed as new customers arrived and others left, and Robert couldn't take his eyes off the piano. When Lisa brought his bill, Robert paid in cash, leaving a tip larger than the cost of the meal. Then, instead of standing to leave, he remained seated, watching the piano like it might vanish if he looked away. The next part happened almost without conscious thought. One moment Robert was sitting at his table, and the next he was standing, walking slowly but purposefully toward the piano. He felt drawn to it like it was pulling him in with an invisible force he couldn't resist even if he wanted to. He was halfway there when Lisa stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "I'm sorry, sir," she said firmly but politely. "As I mentioned, customers aren't allowed to touch the piano." Robert stopped, looking at her face. She wasn't being unkind. She was doing her job. Behind her, several nearby diners had turned to watch the interaction, their curious gazes making Robert's palms sweat. He hadn't been the center of attention like this in years, not since he'd learned how to blend into the background despite his wealth and position. "I understand," Robert said quietly, "but I think I might know what's wrong with it." "I could take a look." Lisa shook her head. "I'm sorry, but those are the rules." "The owner is very strict about it." Robert glanced past her at the piano. So close. After 15 years of avoiding pianos, of walking out of hotels and restaurants at the first hint of live music, of selling the grand piano that had taken up half his first apartment, here he was, desperate to touch this one. Because it wasn't just any piano. It was his piano. "The one where it all began. Is the owner here?" Robert asked. "Could I speak with them?" "He's in the back," Lisa said, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. More people were watching now. A man in a tie at the nearest table had stopped eating entirely, fork suspended halfway to his mouth as he observed the quiet standoff. "Please," Robert said, surprising himself with the emotion in his voice. "5 minutes? That's all I'm asking for." Lisa bit her lip, clearly torn. "I could lose my job," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Robert noticed then how tired she looked, the slight darkness under her eyes, the way she shifted her weight as if her feet hurt, the small stain on her sleeve that she'd probably been too busy to notice. "I promise you won't," he said with quiet certainty. Something in his tone made Lisa hesitate. She looked at him more closely, trying to figure out what it was about this ordinary-looking man in his ordinary clothes that suddenly seemed not ordinary at all. "Why is this piano so important to you?" she asked. Robert took a deep breath. How could he explain? How could he tell her that the last time he touched those keys his mother had been alive, that the world had still made sense? That music had still been his future instead of his past? Because, he said simply, some things deserve to be remembered. Lisa looked at him for a long moment. Then, making a decision she hoped she wouldn't regret, she stepped aside. 5 minutes, she said. "And if Mr. Bailey comes out, I'll take full responsibility," Robert assured her, already moving past her toward the piano that had haunted his dreams for 15 years. As he approached, the restaurant seemed to fall quieter, or maybe that was just the blood rushing in his ears. Robert reached the piano and carefully, almost reverently, lifted the dusty lid covering the keys. They were exactly as he remembered. Slightly yellowed with age, the E-flat key with its distinctive wear pattern. His fingers hovered over them, trembling slightly. He hadn't played in 15 years. Not in public. Not like this. Behind him, he could feel the eyes of the other diners. He could sense Lisa watching nervously. He knew at any moment the owner might emerge and demand he step away, but none of that mattered now. Robert sat down on the bench, adjusted its height with the familiar squeak he remembered, and placed his fingers on the keys. And for the first time in 15 years, Robert Wilson began to play. The first notes that came from the piano were soft, tentative, like someone testing the temperature of water before diving in. Robert's fingers moved slowly across the keys, reacquainting themselves with their old friend. True to Lisa's warning, the E-flat key stuck slightly, and a few others were noticeably out of tune. But underneath the imperfections, the soul of the instrument remained intact. Robert played a simple scale, then another. His hands remembered what his mind had tried to forget. 15 years melted away in an instant. Around him, the restaurant continued its usual bustle, though a few curious diners at nearby tables glanced over, wondering about the unexpected music. Lisa hovered nervously by the kitchen door, keeping an eye out for her boss while occasionally looking back at Robert with a mixture of worry and curiosity. Robert closed his eyes, letting his fingers find their own path. They settled into the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the first piece he had ever performed on this very piano. The melody rose softly in the restaurant, like a question being asked after years of silence. At first, only those closest to the piano noticed. A woman paused mid-bite. An older man turned his head. A child tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed. As Robert continued to play, his confidence grew. His back straightened. His shoulders relaxed. His hands, which had spent the last decade and a half signing contracts and shaking on business deals, remembered their true purpose. The music flowed more freely now, filling the corners of the restaurant. More heads turned. Conversations paused. The clinking of silverware against plates grew less frequent. Without realizing it, the patrons of Charlie's Place were being drawn into something unexpected and rare. Robert was only dimly aware of the change in atmosphere. He was lost in the music and memories and the familiar feel of these specific keys beneath his fingers. The sticky E-flat, the slightly sharp C, the deep resonance of the lower octaves that had always been this piano's greatest strength. He adjusted his playing to accommodate the instrument's quirks, turning its flaws into features just as he had as a boy. The kitchen door swung open, and a stocky man in his 50s emerged, wiping his hands on a dish towel. This must be Mr. Bailey, the owner. Lisa immediately hurried over to him, speaking quickly and gesturing toward Robert. The man's face darkened and he started forward, clearly ready to put an end to the unsanctioned performance. But as he moved toward the piano, the nocturne reached its middle section, the part where Chopin's gentle questioning transforms into something more insistent, more passionate. Robert's playing grew stronger, his emotions flowing through his fingertips into the aged wood and metal of the instrument. The sound filled the restaurant completely now, impossible to ignore. Mr. Bailey stopped in his tracks. His expression changed from anger to surprise, then to something harder to define. He stood still, the dish towel clutched forgotten in his hand, and simply listened. By now, everyone in the restaurant was paying attention. Forks were set down. Drinks remained untouched. Every face was turned toward the unassuming man at the piano who was creating something beautiful, from an instrument most had assumed was just for show. A waitress emerged from the kitchen with plates of food, then stopped, unsure what to do in the strange, suspended moment that had taken over the restaurant. Mr. Bailey noticed her confusion and quietly motioned for her to wait. As the piece neared its conclusion, returning to the gentle questioning of the beginning, Robert felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. For 15 years he had been running from this, from the vulnerability of sharing his music, from the memories it stirred, from the part of himself he had locked away after his mother's death and his public collapse. Yet here he was playing again, and it felt like coming home. The final notes of the nocturne lingered in the air, then faded to silence. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire restaurant was holding its breath. Robert opened his eyes, suddenly very aware of where he was and what he had done. His hands rested lightly on the keys. He could feel dozens of eyes on him. Heat crept up his neck, and for a moment the old panic threatened to return. Then from somewhere in the back of the restaurant, someone began to applaud. Others joined in. Within seconds, the entire restaurant erupted in enthusiastic applause and even a few cheers. Robert turned on the bench, startled by the response. Every person in the restaurant was looking at him, not with the judgment or pity he had feared for so long, but with genuine appreciation and even wonder. Mr. Bailey was still standing near the kitchen, his earlier anger apparently forgotten. He was watching Robert with an intensity that suggested he was trying to solve a puzzle. Lisa approached the piano, her earlier nervousness replaced by amazement. I've never heard anything like that, she said. Where did you learn to play like that? Robert gave her a small smile. Here, he said simply. On this piano. Before Lisa could ask what he meant, Mr. Bailey walked over, his expression unreadable. Robert stood, ready to apologize for breaking the rules. But before he could speak, Mr. Bailey extended his hand. That was something else, the restaurant owner said gruffly. I've owned this place for 20 years, and that piano's never sounded like that. Robert shook the offered hand. It's a special instrument, he said. It just needs someone who understands it. Mr. Bailey studied him. You said you learned on this piano? How's that possible? It's been in my family for almost 30 years. Ever since my father bought it from the old Henderson Music Hall when it closed down. At the mention of the music hall, several diners who had been listening to the conversation murmured with interest. The Henderson had been a local landmark before financial troubles forced it to close in the early 2000s. I used to play there as a student, Robert explained. This piano was on the stage for years. I'd know it anywhere. He ran his hand lightly over the wood, the dent on the side from when a stagehand bumped it with a chair. The pattern of the grain. Even the way certain keys respond, it's like reconnecting with an old friend. Something in Mr. Bailey's expression softened. My father loved this thing. Paid more than he could afford for it because he said it had a history. I never really understood until now. He paused. So what's wrong with it? Why does it sound off-key in some places? It needs tuning, Robert said. That's all. The hammers might need a bit of adjustment, and a few of the keys need to be regulated. Nothing that can't be fixed by someone who knows what they're doing. The restaurant had returned to its normal hum of conversation, though many diners were still casting glances toward the piano corner, and Robert could hear his performance being discussed at several tables. Would you play something else? A woman asked from a nearby table. Her request was immediately echoed by others. Robert hesitated, the old anxiety fluttering in his chest. 15 years was a long time to go without performing. The nocturne had been muscle memory, a piece so ingrained in him he could play it in his sleep. But to continue, to truly perform again, he looked at the expectant faces around him, at Lisa's encouraging smile, at Mr. Bailey, who gave him a small nod, then at the piano, his piano, that had somehow found its way back to him after all these years. Before he could talk himself out of it, Robert sat back down on the bench. This one might be a bit rusty, he said with a self-deprecating smile. I haven't played it in a while. His fingers found the keys, and the opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor filled the restaurant. This piece was different, darker, more demanding, filled with the Russian composer's trademark intensity and complexity. As Robert played, he felt something inside him awakening, like a part of himself that had been sleeping for 15 years was finally stretching, yawning, opening its eyes. His fingers stumbled once or twice over particularly challenging passages, testament to his years away from serious practice. But the mistakes didn't matter. What mattered was the music, the connection, the release of emotions long bottled up. The restaurant grew quiet again, but this time the silence had a different quality. It was the silence of people experiencing something they knew was special, something they might tell others about years later. I was there the night that man played the piano at Charlie's place. As the piece reached its thundering climax, Robert's entire body was involved in the playing, leaning into the fortissimo sections, swaying with the rhythm, his face expressing every emotion that Rachmaninoff had poured into the composition. He was no longer concerned about who might be watching or what they might think. He was simply a musician again, doing what he was born to do. When the final chord died away, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the restaurant erupted in enthusiastic applause, louder and more sustained than before. Several people rose to their feet. A woman in the corner wiped tears from her eyes. Robert stood slightly embarrassed by the reaction, but also exhilarated in a way he hadn't felt in years. Mr. Bailey was shaking his head in amazement. Lisa was beaming, and from the kitchen doorway, the entire staff had emerged to see what was happening in their usually ordinary restaurant. "Who are you?" Mr. Bailey asked, voicing the question that seemed to be on everyone's mind. Robert hesitated, knowing that giving his full name might change everything. Robert Wilson wasn't just anyone. He was one of the richest men in the country, a business magnate whose face occasionally appeared in financial magazines and news segments. If they knew who he was, this moment would transform from something genuine to something colored by his wealth and status. "Just someone who loves this piano," he said finally, "and who's very grateful you kept it all these years, even if you didn't know why." Mr. Bailey nodded slowly, seeming to sense there was more to the story, but respecting Robert's privacy. "Well, whoever you are," he said, "you're welcome to play here anytime." The simple statement hit Robert with unexpected force. Anytime. After 15 years of silence, of running from his gift, he had been given permission to return, not to the pressure-filled concert halls of his youth, but to this simple restaurant where people came for good food and company, not to judge or critique. For the first time in a very long time, Robert felt the future opening up before him again, full of possibilities he had thought were long gone, and the piano, his piano, waited patiently for whatever would come next. Word spread quickly through the small town about the mysterious piano player at Charlie's place. By the next evening, there was a line outside the door and Mr. Bailey had to turn people away. The local newspaper sent a reporter, who sat at a corner table with a notepad waiting. 3 high school music students arrived early to get the best seats near the piano, but there was no sign of Robert. "Do you think he'll come back?" Lisa asked Mr. Bailey as they watched the crowd grow. She had arrived an hour before her shift started, her hair neatly combed and her uniform freshly ironed. Small details that hadn't seemed important yesterday. "Who knows?" Mr. Bailey replied, though there was hope in his voice. Last night's impromptu performance had brought in more business than the restaurant had seen in months. People like that, they blow into town, make their mark, then disappear. But Lisa wasn't so sure. There had been something in Robert's eyes when he touched that piano. A hunger. A need that couldn't be satisfied with just one night of playing. By 8 o'clock, the restaurant was packed, but the piano remained untouched. The reporter was on his second cup of coffee. The high school students were checking their watches, disappointment starting to show on their young faces. Lisa was delivering a tray of drinks to a table when the front door opened. She turned, hoping to see Robert, but it was just an older woman with silver hair, dressed in simple but elegant clothes. She stood in the doorway, scanning the room with sharp eyes, then made her way to the only empty seat at the bar. "I heard there was a piano player here last night," the woman said to no one in particular. Her voice carried a hint of authority that made several heads turn. "You heard right," the bartender replied, placing a menu in front of her. "But he's not here tonight. Can I get you something to drink?" The woman ignored the question. "Was he good? Good?" The bartender laughed. "Lady, I don't know anything about classical music, but he made grown men cry." The woman nodded as if this confirmed something she already knew. She ordered a glass of red wine, then turned on her stool to look at the piano in the corner. There was something in her gaze, a mixture of sadness and pride, that caught Lisa's attention. The night wore on. Some customers, tired of waiting, paid their bills and left. Others seemed content to enjoy their meals, piano performance or not. The reporter finally gave up and headed back to the newspaper office to write about the anticipation instead of the event. The high school students stayed, nursing their sodas and occasionally plinking out a few notes on the piano when Mr. Bailey wasn't looking. It was nearly 10 o'clock, closing time, when the front door opened again. This time it was Robert. He looked different tonight, clean-shaven, wearing a collared shirt under his sweater. His eyes widened slightly at the crowd, and for a moment, Lisa thought he might turn around and leave. Then he saw the silver-haired woman at the bar. He froze, color draining from his face. The woman stood slowly. "Hello, Bobby," she said, using a name no one in the restaurant had heard before. Her voice was steady, but her hands gripped her purse tightly. "Aunt Grace," Robert replied, his voice barely audible over the restaurant chatter. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, sensing the drama unfolding but not understanding it. Lisa looked between the two of them, piecing together that this woman, this Aunt Grace, was somehow connected to Robert's past, the past he had been so reluctant to talk about. Mr. Bailey approached Robert with a broad smile, unaware of the tension. "We were starting to think you wouldn't show," he said, clapping Robert on the shoulder. "Got a full house tonight, all hoping to hear you play. Robert barely seemed to hear him. His eyes were locked on his aunt, who was now making her way toward him, weaving between tables with purpose. 15 years, she said when she reached him. 15 years without a word. A few nearby diners exchanged glances, realizing they were witnessing something private. Mr. Bailey, sensing the delicacy of the situation, discreetly backed away. "How did you find me?" Robert asked. "Small-town newspaper website," Grace replied. "Someone posted about a mystery pianist who played Chopin and Rachmaninoff at the local restaurant. Said he seemed to have a personal connection to the old Henderson Hall piano." She gave a small, sad smile. "Didn't take a detective to figure out it was you." Robert swallowed hard. "I was going to call. Eventually." 15 years is a long eventually, Bobby. The restaurant had grown quieter, the conversations dying down as people tried to listen without seeming to. Lisa busied herself wiping down a nearby table, unable to pull herself away from the unfolding drama. "I couldn't face it," Robert said softly. "After what happened. After I let everyone down." Grace's expression softened. "The only person you let down was yourself. And maybe her by hiding your gift away all these years." At the mention of her, whoever that was, Robert's eyes filled with tears. He blinked them back quickly, but not before Lisa noticed. Whoever this woman was talking about, she had been important to Robert. "Play something for me," Grace said, nodding toward the piano. "Play something for her." The request hung in the air between them. Around them, the restaurant was now almost completely silent, everyone watching, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, Robert nodded. He moved toward the piano, each step seeming to require effort, as if he were walking through deep water. When he reached the bench, he sat down slowly, adjusting his position with the same care he had shown the night before. Grace found a seat at the nearest table. Her face was composed, but her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Robert placed his fingers on the keys, closed his eyes for a moment, then began to play. The piece was different from the ones he had played the previous night, slower, sadder, filled with a quiet yearning that seemed to reach into every corner of the restaurant. Lisa didn't recognize the music, but she could feel its meaning. This was a conversation between Robert and his aunt, between Robert and whoever she was, between Robert and himself. As the music continued, Lisa noticed tears streaming down Grace's face. The older woman made no attempt to wipe them away. She simply sat listening, as if receiving a message she had been waiting years to hear. When the piece came to its gentle conclusion, Robert's hands remained on the keys for several seconds. When he finally turned to face his aunt, his own cheeks were wet. No one in the restaurant applauded. It would have felt wrong somehow, like clapping in church. This hadn't been a performance. It had been something much more intimate. Grace stood and walked to the piano. Without a word, she embraced her nephew. Robert stiffened at first, then relaxed into her arms, his shoulders shaking slightly. "She would have been so proud," Grace whispered, loud enough that those nearest could hear. "So proud of everything you've built, everything you've become." "But Bobby, she would have been heartbroken to know you gave up the thing you loved most." Robert pulled back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I thought it would hurt too much," he said, "to play without her there to hear it." "She's always hearing it," Grace replied. "And now so are we." She gestured to the restaurant full of people, many of whom were discreetly dabbing at their own eyes. "Don't disappear again. The world needs your music. I need to know you're out there somewhere playing for her." Robert looked around the restaurant, seeming to truly see the crowd for the first time. His eyes landed on Lisa, who gave him an encouraging smile. "I have a business to run," he said to his aunt, but there was less conviction in his voice than there might have been yesterday. "Responsibilities. People who depend on me." "And you have music inside you that needs to come out," Grace countered. "You can have both, Bobby. You just need to find the balance your mother never could." At the mention of his mother, Robert's expression changed, a flash of old pain quickly covered by resolution. He nodded slowly, then turned back to the piano. "This one's for all of you," he said, addressing the restaurant for the first time, "for giving me back something I thought was lost." He began to play again, this time a piece that started quietly but built gradually into something joyful and triumphant. The music filled the small restaurant, wrapping around each person there, connecting them in the shared experience. Lisa watched from her spot by the wall, a strange feeling growing inside her. She had worked at Charlie's place for 3 years, serving food, clearing tables, counting her tips at the end of each shift. It was just a job, a way to pay the bills. But tonight, the restaurant had transformed into something else. A place where healing could happen. A place where beauty could be found in unexpected corners. A place where a man who had everything money could buy had rediscovered the one thing it couldn't purchase: his passion, his purpose. As Robert played on, his fingers dancing across the keys of the piano he had thought was lost to him forever, Lisa made a decision. Tomorrow she would ask Mr. Bailey about music nights at the restaurant. Maybe they could make this a regular thing, not just with Robert, but with other local musicians. Maybe Charlie's place could become known for more than just good food. Maybe, just maybe, they had all witnessed the beginning of something special. And for the first time in a long while, Lisa felt excited about what tomorrow might bring. 3 weeks later, Charlie's place was unrecognizable. Mr. Bailey had rearranged the tables to create a small performance area around the piano. String lights hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the space. A hand-painted sign by the entrance now read, "Charlie's Place, food for the soul. Music for the heart." Thursday, Friday, and Saturday nights were booked solid 2 weeks in advance. And at the center of it all was Robert. He hadn't meant for things to change so dramatically. That night with Aunt Grace had been meant as closure, a chance to reconnect with his past before returning to his carefully constructed present. He had a company to run after all, board meetings to attend, investment decisions that affected thousands of employees. But somehow, he couldn't bring himself to leave, just until the piano was properly restored. He had told Grace when she asked how long he planned to stay in town. That had been his excuse. The piano tuner, a white-haired man with thick glasses who had come out of retirement specially for the job, had taken one look at the old instrument and whistled low. "This will take some time," he had said. "We're not just tuning here. We're bringing history back to life." So Robert had stayed, taking a room at the small inn down the street. His assistant in the city was handling the day-to-day operations of his company. His board members had been told he was taking a much-needed vacation after 15 years of non-stop work. Only a few people knew where he actually was. Tonight was the piano's official re-debut. The tuner had finished his work that morning, declaring the instrument better than new. Mr. Bailey had splurged on new cocktail menus for the occasion. Lisa had spent her day off helping to decorate the restaurant. Robert sat in his room at the inn, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He had purchased a suit. Nothing too flashy, just a simple black jacket and pants with a white shirt. He hadn't worn anything like it since his last concert as a teenager. His phone buzzed with messages from the business world he had temporarily left behind. Stock prices, acquisition opportunities, questions that only he could answer. He ignored them all. Instead, he opened the small, worn photo he kept in his wallet, the one of him and his mother after his first public performance on the Henderson Hall piano. He was 11, beaming with pride. She was radiant, her arm around his shoulders, looking at him like he had hung the moon. "I'm playing again, Mom," he whispered to the photo, "on our piano." A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Aunt Grace, elegant in a simple blue dress. "Ready?" she asked. He took a deep breath. "Not really," she smiled knowingly. "You said the same thing before every recital. Your mother would always tell you. The day I'm completely ready is the day I should stop playing," Robert finished, the old words coming back easily. "Because it means I've stopped being afraid and fear keeps us honest." Grace nodded. "Smart woman, your mother." She looked him over with an appraising eye. "You'll do. Come on, your public awaits." As they walked the short distance to the restaurant, Robert's mind drifted to the past few weeks. He had played every night, sometimes just a piece or two, sometimes for hours. People from neighboring towns had started coming. Music students watched his hands with wide eyes, trying to absorb his technique. Elderly couples closed their eyes and swayed to melodies that transported them to their youth. And through it all, Robert had felt something shifting inside him, like a wall slowly crumbling brick by brick. When they reached Charlie's place, the line outside stretched down the block. Mr. Bailey stood at the door checking reservations, looking more like the maitre d' of a five-star restaurant than the owner of a small-town eatery. "There he is," someone called when they spotted Robert. A few people clapped. A teenage girl asked for his autograph, thrusting a music book toward him. Robert signed it with a shaky hand, still not used to being recognized. Inside, the restaurant hummed with anticipation. Lisa waved from behind the bar where she was pouring wine. The piano sat in its place of honor, gleaming under the lights, its wood polished to a rich shine. As Robert made his way to the instrument, people reached out to touch his arm, to thank him, to tell him how his music had moved them. An older man gripped his hand and said, "My wife and I had our first date at Henderson Hall 60 years ago. When you play, it's like being there again." By the time Robert reached the piano, his throat was tight with emotion. He sat down, adjusted the bench, and looked out at the crowd. There were faces he had come to know over the past weeks. The local doctor who requested Debussy, the English teacher who cried every time he played Chopin, the group of teenagers who had started coming to listen instead of hanging out at the mall. And there were new faces too. People drawn by word of mouth, by the videos that had started appearing online, by the story of the millionaire businessman who had found his way back to his first love. Robert placed his fingers on the keys, now perfectly in tune, responsive to the slightest touch. The crowd fell silent, waiting. For his opening piece, he had chosen something special, a composition his mother had written years ago, one that had never been performed publicly. He had spent the past week recalling it from memory, writing it down note by note, making sure it was perfect. "This first piece is called Coming Home," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet restaurant. "It was written by my mother, who was a concert pianist and composer. She believed that music wasn't just something you heard. It was something you felt in your bones, in your heart, in your soul." He began to play, and from the first notes, something magical happened. The piece was gentle, wistful at first, like someone remembering a place they had once loved. Then it grew, becoming more confident, more joyful, building toward a realization that home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a feeling. Sometimes it's a piano in a small restaurant in a town you never meant to stay in. As the music filled the room, Robert glanced at Aunt Grace, who had tears streaming down her face. She had never heard this piece before. His mother had composed it in the months after Grace moved away, when the sisters were barely speaking to each other. It was a peace offering that had never been delivered, until now. Around the room, people were caught in the spell of the music. A couple held hands across their table, leaning toward each other as if the notes were pulling them closer. A young girl swayed with her eyes closed, a smile on her face. Mr. Bailey stood in the doorway to the kitchen, arms crossed over his chest, nodding slightly with the rhythm. Lisa watched from behind the bar, amazed at how much had changed in just a few weeks. The restaurant had been transformed. The town had been transformed. And Robert, the quiet, sad-eyed man who had walked in that first night, he had been transformed most of all. As the piece reached its conclusion, rising to one final, hopeful chord, Robert felt a sense of completion wash over him. His mother's music had found its audience at last. The piano had found its voice again, and he had found something he thought was lost forever. The applause was deafening. People rose to their feet, clapping, some wiping away tears. Robert stood and bowed, gesturing toward the piano as if to say it deserved the credit, not him. When the applause finally died down, he returned to the bench for his next piece. But before he could begin, the front door of the restaurant burst open. A tall, thin man in an expensive suit rushed in, looking harried and out of place. His eyes scanned the room frantically before landing on Robert. Relief flooded his face. "Mr. Wilson," he called out, forgetting in his urgency that Robert had been keeping a low profile. "Thank goodness I found you." A murmur went through the crowd. Mr. Wilson, Robert Wilson. The name was familiar to many of them, though they couldn't quite place it. Robert froze, his hands hovering above the keys. His two worlds were colliding in the most public way possible. The man in the suit hurried toward the piano, oblivious to the stir he was creating. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's an emergency. The board is meeting in an hour. The Westridge deal is falling apart. They say they'll only negotiate with you directly." Lisa, who had been refilling water glasses nearby, stopped in her tracks. The pieces clicked into place. Robert Wilson, the tech billionaire whose face occasionally appeared in business magazines and news programs. The man whose net worth was more than the entire town's annual budget combined. She looked at Robert with new eyes, not with awe at his wealth, but with amazement that he had kept it hidden, that he had allowed himself to be just a piano player in a small restaurant for these past weeks. Robert was silent for a long moment, looking between his assistant, the waiting audience, and the piano. His past and his present, his duty and his passion. Then he smiled, a small, decisive smile. "Tell them they'll have to wait," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the quiet restaurant. "I have a performance to finish," and with that, he turned back to the piano and began to play. 1 year later, the sign outside the restaurant read, "Charlie's Music Hall and Eatery." The building next door had been purchased, the wall between knocked down, creating a space twice the original size. Tables still filled half the area, but the other half held rows of comfortable chairs facing a small stage. On that stage sat the piano, now joined by a drum set, a couple of guitars on stands, and a professional sound system. Robert stood at the back, watching people file in for the evening's performance. He recognized most of them, loyal customers who had been coming since those first magical nights. But there were new faces too, tourists who had read about the place online or heard about it from friends. Charlie's had become something of a destination. "Nervous?" Lisa asked, appearing beside him. She no longer wore a waitress uniform. These days she managed the music side of the business while taking online classes to finish her nursing degree. The dark circles under her eyes were gone, replaced by a confidence that made her stand taller. Always, Robert admitted. No matter how many times he performed now, the butterflies never quite went away, but they had changed from terrifying to exhilarating, a reminder that what he was doing mattered. "Full house tonight," Lisa said. "And guess who just arrived?" She nodded toward the door. Robert turned to see a group of children filing in, ages ranging from about 8 to 16, each carrying an instrument case. Behind them walked their teacher, a young woman Robert had hired from the city conservatory. These were the students of the Wilson Music Foundation, named not after Robert, but after his mother. Children from the town and surrounding rural areas who showed interest and talent, but whose families couldn't afford instruments or lessons. What had started as a small project, buying a few instruments, hiring one teacher, had grown into a full-fledged program with 30 students and 3 instructors. Tonight was their first public performance. They would play the opening set, then Robert would take the stage, and finally they would join together for a special piece he had arranged just for them. Mr. Robert, a small girl with braids and a violin case nearly as big as she was, broke away from the group and ran to him. "I remembered all my parts. I practiced every single day, even when my brother said it was annoying." Robert knelt down to her level. "I bet you're going to be the star of the show, Lizzie." She beamed at him, then scurried back to her group, proudly telling the others about her conversation with Mr. Robert. "You've changed their lives," Lisa said softly. "All of ours, really." Robert shook his head. "The piano changed my life. I'm just paying it forward." The restaurant continued to fill. Mr. Bailey, now dressed in a suit that still seemed to surprise him when he caught his reflection, greeted people at the door. His son had taken over the kitchen, allowing Mr. Bailey to focus on being the face of the establishment that bore his father's name. Aunt Grace arrived, accompanied by Robert's assistant from the city, the same harried man who had burst in a year ago with urgent business. He was less harried these days. Working for Robert had become significantly less stressful since his boss had restructured his life. 3 days a week, Robert was in the city, running his technology company with the same brilliance that had made him a millionaire. The other 4 days he was here, teaching music, performing, and overseeing the foundation. It wasn't a perfect balance. Both worlds sometimes demanded more of him than he could give, but it was a balance he was continually refining. As the start time approached, Robert made his way backstage. The children were tuning their instruments, faces serious with concentration. Their teacher was giving last-minute instructions, adjusting bow holds and finger positions. Robert's phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked it quickly, a message from his COO about a potential new acquisition. Important but not urgent. It could wait until tomorrow. A year ago, he wouldn't have been able to make that distinction. Everything had seemed urgent, demanding his immediate attention. Now he understood that very few things couldn't wait a few hours or even a day. The lights dimmed slightly and Mr. Bailey walked onto the stage to welcome the audience. Robert listened as he introduced the Wilson Music Foundation students for their debut performance. The crowd applauded encouragingly as the children filed onto the stage, some looking terrified, others grinning with excitement. Robert watched from the wings as they played their first piece, a simple melody arranged for their varied skill levels. There were missed notes and timing issues, but there was also joy in their faces as they created music together. The audience responded warmly, with genuine appreciation rather than mere politeness. After the children set, it was Robert's turn. He walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause, the sight no longer strange to him as it had been in those early days. He sat at the piano, his piano, and began to play. He started with Chopin, the composer whose work had reconnected him with music that first night at Charlie's. Then moved to a piece by a contemporary composer who pushed the boundaries of classical music in exciting ways. Then one of his own compositions, something he had only recently found the courage to share. As Robert played, he thought about the journey of the past year. How close he had come to walking away that night his assistant had found him. How the choice to stay and finish his performance had led to another choice and another, each one bringing him closer to a life that honored all parts of himself. The businessman and the artist, the success story, and the small-town boy who had once dreamed of nothing but music. For the final portion of the show, the students returned to the stage, arranging themselves around the piano. Robert had spent weeks working with them on this piece, an arrangement of his mother's coming home adapted for their young hands and developing skills. As they began to play together, Robert felt a familiar tightness in his chest, not the panic of his younger years, but something fuller, warmer. Pride. Not for himself, but for these children finding their voices through music, for the community that had embraced this transformation, for the journey that had brought him full circle. From her seat in the front row, Aunt Grace watched with shining eyes. Beside her sat Lisa, who had requested the night off to experience the show as an audience member for once. Mr. Bailey stood at the back, arms crossed over his chest, nodding in time with the music. And somewhere Robert believed his mother was listening too. When the final notes faded, the audience erupted in applause. The children beamed, taking their bows with varying degrees of awkwardness and grace. Robert stood behind them, hands raised to direct the applause toward his young students. Later, after the crowd had thinned and the children had gone home with their parents, clutching their instruments and high on the thrill of performance, Robert sat alone at the piano. The restaurant was quiet now, just a few staff cleaning up, the chairs empty. He played softly, not for an audience this time, but for himself. A simple melody that had been forming in his mind for weeks. Lisa approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one beside him on the piano and leaned against the instrument, listening. "New piece?" she asked when he paused. "Maybe," Robert replied. "Still working it out." She nodded, understanding that some compositions took time to reveal themselves fully. The kids were amazing tonight. They were, he agreed, smiling at the memory of their proud faces. "Did you see Lizzie? Not a single missed note." "Mr. Bailey says we've already sold out next month's showcase," Lisa said. "And the foundation got 3 more applications this week." Robert nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "I'm thinking of expanding. Maybe open another branch in the next town over. There's a middle school music program that lost its funding." "Always thinking ahead," Lisa said with a smile. "But don't forget to enjoy where you are right now." Robert looked around the empty restaurant, at the space that had transformed from a simple eatery to a place where dreams were born and nurtured. At the piano that had been silent for years until his fingers brought it back to life. At Lisa, who had gone from an overworked waitress to a confident manager pursuing her own dreams. "Right now is pretty good," he admitted. He turned back to the piano and continued the new melody, letting it grow and change beneath his fingers. It wasn't perfect yet. It might never be. But that was the beauty of music, of life. It didn't need to be perfect to be meaningful. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the sign that now proudly proclaimed the building's dual purpose. Inside, warmed by music and memory, Robert Wilson played on, each note a step further on the journey home.